Alright, this is the final Tales of the Realm video where I'll be going over a few of the unused assets for the game just to give you an idea of where this game might have gone, what it might have been in its final incarnation. So I'll start with the character sprites here. These would be the party members that you could recruit over the course of the game. Alphonse the Alchemist was covered in the demo. Anton is a powerful mage who, if you remember from the very first video, there was a sealed door, and I believe that side quest was going to tie into recruiting this guy. And one of the prerequisites was going to be Nikolai, your other potential wizard party member. Him dying was going to be the catalyst for recruiting Anton. And he had, I believe his backstory had something to do with him kind of going into stasis or hibernation until a creature called the Endbringer came back to the world, and that's one of the monster sprites I'll be showing. Dorian, kind of a ripoff of Aragorn, to be honest here. He's a ranger and a deposed heir to the throne, and one of his techniques his special commands was going to be monster techniques that he could learn by witnessing them being used by monsters he would fight and defeat. So in a way, he would kind of be a blue mage, if you're familiar with that concept from Final Fantasy. Edward is a farm boy psychic whose lands had been ravaged by the antagonist, and he's not really in control of his powers. So if you look at his eyes there, they're pure blue and crackling with energy. So those are his psychic powers manifesting. So his skill commands would be psychic abilities and then fist techniques. You can kind of tell he has some studded leather gloves there, so he would have some punching abilities to use in combat. Garrett, we know. Kelvin is a minor aristocrat who would use axes and also crossbows. And I forget if those were his two skill commands or if he had another one that dealt with being a noble. I think he had the plan was for him to have some different abilities like paying off enemies and hiring, calling in a mercenary army as kind of an ultimate technique. And I think using a human shield was another one of those abilities. So it's kind of a fun character. And he's also kind of evil. There's a side quest plot involving him killing a family who happens to be family members of Maximilian, a gunslinger type character. And that side quest would eventually culminate in these two fighting and only one of them surviving. I think there might have been a conversation tree where instead of fighting, Maximilian just walks off. But either way, at the end game, a completionist would only have one of these two characters. I think at one point I thought I might put myself in as a secret character. Realistically, I don't think I'd let that happen. The creator character was just going to be for the demo, but I guess the monster sprite also works as a character sprite. Nikolai, we also know. Sigmund would be sequentially probably the fourth party member. If I didn't mention so before, I had designed the game to be pretty open-ended in terms of what quests you do, what party members you have, where in theory you could skip almost all the content and march straight to the final boss. You'd probably die, but I thought it might be interesting to have that degree of freedom. But assuming you were going the normal intended complete route for the game, you'd meet Sigmund early on, and he's kind of the medieval fantasy equivalent of a Ronin. He's a bodyguard type character, the strong and silent type, who you would Garrett would hire as a bodyguard early on, and Sigmund would basically follow him throughout the game. So this character is going to have high hit points, high defense, some devastating sword techniques with that great sword. You can see it's almost as tall as he is. I forget exactly what special commands he had. Probably sword techniques, and then maybe something around protection. Kind of like some of the knight or paladin characters in other games. Victor is a mercenary. At one point in the game, you would be able to hire him, and then he would leave around the midpoint if you still had him by then, and then he could rejoin in the second half of the game at a higher level. And I think one of the mechanics I had around him is that his level was static. So it'd either be, I think, level 35 in the first half or 55 in the second half. And his skills were going to be, I think, gun and sword techniques for one of the commands, and then an assassinate type ability where one turn you would mark a character, and then the second turn you could activate it to damage that marked character and do some pretty significant damage, since this guy is kind of a hired assassin type character. And it would turn out later on in the game that he's kind of a double agent, I suppose, that is working for the main antagonist, and right before the final dungeon he would basically give you an ultimatum of turning on the party or getting paid off and buying his loyalty for that final segment of the game. And also made separate sprites for characters being wounded. I think I was fortunate enough during the demo to not have anyone die, but these are the sprites that would appear if they reached 0 hit points. And I don't have them for everyone, but I do have about half of the characters. That one's a little more bloody than the others, and Dorian being a little hardier than some of the characters, really doesn't get knocked down entirely. He's just taking a breather, I guess. Kind of like the Alphonse sprite there with the broken flask, glasses falling off. Alright, on to the monsters. The Lurker sprite, I had some fun doing palette swaps of that. So this would be kind of the mid-level version of a Lurker. He's got some claws there, and a gray and green palette instead of the brown tones for the first version. This is one of the headmasters that would be on the 4th or 5th level of that Wizard Tower dungeon, of which I only implemented 2 levels for the demo. So each one kind of had a different element. This one's fire. There should be a few more that I'd finished. Hellhound. This was going to be a later game enemy. Palette swap of a wolf with burning eyes, I think some sharper teeth than the other sprites, and a flaming tail. And I think this was meant to be kind of a rocky, cooled magma type of skin here instead of just fur. Another one of the headmasters, this time ice instead of fire. The Mage Stone characters, I think the Mage Stone Knight is the only one I had drawn out, but they were going to be the elite soldiers of the main antagonist, and I think there's going to be a subplot, or at least an aesthetic of this, the main antagonist using something called Mage Stone to amplify magic powers. So here he's got a helmet, Mage Stone visor, and a spear or gun. I think it might have been a combination of the two, or maybe it could fire some sort of magic blast from the end there. But yeah, these were kind of the grunts of the final area of the game. Can't see it too well here because it's white on a white background, but if this were to be put onto a actual battle background, you'd see it a little better, and you can kind of see that over here. But the Mist Soldiers that were going to be summoned by the Bard mentor character that would be in the cave that for the demo had the creator special boss. The ogre here was going to be a large enemy type, whereas the current battle interface only has 4 slots for normal-sized enemies. I was going to implement the possibility of just having one really big enemy, and the ogre was going to be one of those. This is a giant wooden club here, just in case it wasn't clear. Let's see. Proto-Evil was going to be the high-end endgame version of the Lurker. And again, I kind of had fun with palette swapping it here. Kind of a black and red infernal type theme going on. And the Endbringer, another large size enemy, and this was more or less going to be the secret boss that potentially would have been more powerful than the standard final boss. This gigantic, kind of rocky, hot magma type of body, glowing eyes, horns, teeth, giant sword with a flaming handle, and I think this might have been a void blast of some sort of magical attack. And Victor here, in with the monster sprites, since he could potentially be a boss near the end of the game if you don't pay him off well enough. Another one of the headmasters, this time a darkness type element. And those are all monsters we've seen in the demo otherwise. So one more thing, the world map. So I drew out what would more or less be the same, the full version of the map, the same as what would be in the final version, assuming I didn't think of some other dungeon to add in between. So this area, if you follow the cursor, is pretty much what the demo showed. So the full map was going to be a lot bigger, and I'll try to briefly cover what some of the areas were going to be. This town is where you are going to be able to recruit Sigmund, that knight character, and it's going to be a bit bigger, so I was going to have some side quests in there. I think I might have had some sort of a thieves guild and probably a few other quest seeds that might send you elsewhere on the map. This was going to be a secret dungeon, potentially. I forget exactly what would trigger it appearing, but this is what it would look like after it submerges from the ocean. And I have some things in place where a trigger would have this image appear, and otherwise it was going to be just ocean with a darker patch of water here to show the presence of that tower. This town I don't think had anything special about it. This one would be where you recruit Kelvin and potentially have that standoff between Kelvin and Maximilian. This oasis, I think, might have been involved with the dungeon of some sort. Forget what this one was going to be. I think it might have been some sort of stronghold for some enemy type of creature, possibly more orcs or goblin type things. This small town here, I think, might have just been the area where you'd have some sort of character to buy tickets from to rent the boat here. If that isn't clear what that is, which then would take you to this section of the map, and there would be some undead type creatures in this area and a partially sunken ship dungeon. And I forget if anything particularly plot relevant would happen here, but it'd be some extra dungeons to build up levels and gather some treasure. This here, I believe, is going to tie into the Endbringer side quest, and potentially was going to be a spot where you could fight different enemies from other portions in the game. So going back to Final Fantasy VI, I think it would be similar to the Veld, where it's a combination of all the different enemies you've encountered over the course of the game. Got a little camp here. Forget what that was. This cave was going to be where you fight a dragon and plunder the dragon's hoard. So that dragon would be a pretty high level boss, probably just under the final boss in terms of difficulty. Forget what this was going to be, probably a mining town of some sort. Same with this, not quite sure. This mist forest was going to be home to some sort of powerful monster that Dorian would have you hunt, and that would be part of the quest to keep him as a permanent party member. And this kind of looks like a pyramid, but I think it was intended to be a tent, and that's where you'd meet Dorian. Possibly it was actually a pyramid dungeon of some sort. I'd have to consult my notes. I've forgotten since then. Another small town with a dock. This town is where you would meet Edward, the psychic character. And I believe the intention was, upon entering that town, it would be in the middle of an invasion or occupation by the antagonist's forces, so you'd probably be fighting off some Magestone knights and characters along those lines before you recruit Edward. This dungeon here was going to be a ruin with a subterranean ruin with some shadow type characters, and I believe my intention was at the ending to have it start collapsing and be swarmed by shadows, so it'd be a bit of a dramatic escape from there. And this cave here would be one of the few plot events that you would need to encounter to finish the game. And along with Dorian being kind of a ripoff of Aragorn, this would be kind of a ripoff of the Mines of Moria from The Lord of the Rings. And that would involve fighting some of the main antagonists' lieutenants, so I'd have some kind of colorful boss characters there, and I think you'd be fighting some of those deeplings that recolor of the lurker enemy in here. And then this is the final boss's fortress. I believe you'd have to clear these two towers before this would open up, and there's a separate little image that'd be overlaid on the map to show a glowing blue barrier here. So you'd clear these first and then proceed to the main castle here. And that final castle, what I had intended to do is that it would be split into, upon entering, you'd be forced to split your party into two groups, one of which would try to destroy a reactor type of thing that would disable the antagonist shields, some sort of barrier, and the other one would be a strike team to take on that final boss. So I thought the splitting of the parties would be interesting. It's been done before, but would kind of force you to think strategically, and it would also be an incentive to gather up some of the party members all over the map rather than just charging straight to the final boss. That final boss was going to be named, I believe, Alistair Macht, and he's going to be a powerful wizard and would probably be flanked by some of his elite guards. But I believe that covers it for the map. As you can see, there are a lot of dungeons to be added. I think it would amount to a fairly sizable amount of content, and if you look at the run times for those other videos, the demo ran probably about an hour and a half, not including level grinding, and that just covered this small corner. So as you can see, it probably would have amounted to at least 15-20 hour game, possibly longer, in its final incarnation, were I to actually go through and make the whole thing. But that covers pretty much everything I've done for the game, and that ends this series of videos. If there's anything you're curious about or have questions about that I covered during these videos, if you're curious about what would have been, or for some reason you're interested in a collaboration of some sort, do leave a comment in the comment section for the video. I'll be glad to respond and let you know what I was thinking if you're curious. I hope you enjoyed this. Maybe not just entertaining, it might be a little enlightening as to what goes into making a game. That's it. Hope you enjoyed.